And then he goes on in verses 12 and then verses 19 through 20 to show how the savagery of sin gives opportunities for the enemy to work against us. Notice there he says, "Those also who seek my life lay snares for me. Those who seek my hurt speak of destruction and plan deception all the day long." Drop down to verses 19 and 20. "But my enemies are vigorous, and they are strong, and those who hate me wrongfully have multiplied. Those also who render evil for good. They are my adversaries, because I follow what is good." So, the idea there is that you are somebody who professes faith in God, who professes to live with God, to follow God. And yet you have this sin present in your life, and those enemies of God look at you and see the things that you're doing, and it causes them to blaspheme God. That's what Paul says of the Jews in the first century that were looking at the Gentiles and saying how wicked the Gentiles were. And David turns around in Romans chapter 2 and says, now you Jews are just as bad as those Gentiles and worse, because you have the law and you condemn them for doing those things, yet you yourselves are doing the same things. And he says, the name of God is blasphemed because of you. Because of the way that you are embracing this savage beast that is sin. The enemies of God are looking at that and they're blaspheming God. I know you've heard me make reference to this quote before. It's a very popular quote. It says the worst enemy of Christianity many times is Christians. And we talked about in Revelation where the Lord wrote to Laodicea that I would rather you be cold than to be lukewarm. He says, I could wish that you were hot or cold, but you are lukewarm. And I will vomit you out of my mouth. The only place in the Bible where God is pictured as being physically ill. And what is it? It's lukewarm Christians. Why? Because that's one of the most dangerous things to the spread of Christianity. People look at lukewarm Christians that profess one thing with their mouth and live something different in their life, and it damages the effectiveness of the gospel to reach those people, because they look at the gospel and they look at that person and they say, well, if that's what Christianity looks like, I don't want any of that. Sin gives opportunity for the enemies of God to work on us. And so, David describes the conditions caused by savage sin. And then we see as we go back through the psalm, we can go back through the psalm and survey it again, because in that same survey of the conditions caused by savage sin, we see the correction for savage sin. And we go back to verses 1 and 2, the same place we started, that we pointed out that the conditions of savage sin is the chastening of the Lord. Well, that's the correction for savage sin also, to be receptive to the chastening of the Lord. Look at Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 11. Where the Hebrews writer goes into great detail about the chastening of the Lord. And then he comes down to verse 11, and he says there, now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present. So just like he talked about the passing pleasure of sin, he talks about chastening. And you know, when we are being corrected, when we are in the throes of chastening, it's not pleasant. That's the whole point of chastening. It's like when you're, now for me it was always my dad. My mom was never the disciplinarian, it was my dad. And I still remember vividly the first time he spanked me with a belt. And he said what probably every dad has said throughout the history of time, this is going to hurt me more than it does you. And when he got done, I thought, well, he lied. It wasn't pleasant, but I learned my lesson, and I never did again what I got spanked for. And so he says, now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been, notice it, trained by it. So David starts out the psalm talking about the conditions caused by the savagery of sin, including the chastening of the Lord. And he describes that chastening very severely, like being pierced through with arrows, being pressed down with a heavy hand. But if we're receptive to the chastening of the Lord, what will it do? It will train us to be able to correct the sin in our lives, to be able to avoid that in the future. And I go back to the title of the psalm where David says, to bring remembrance. Well, to bring remembrance of what? To bring remembrance of how hurtful this sin was in my life so that I don't want it anymore. I want to avoid it at all cost because it was like being pierced through with arrows and pressed down by the hand of God. So we correct savage sin by being receptive to the chastening of the Lord. And then we see in verse 9, Psalm 38 and verse 9, that the correction for savage sin is found in the desire to be with the Lord. Because when we recognize that this sin being present in our life alienates us from God. You know, David talks about there in verse 11 being alienated from friends and family, but the sin in our lives alienates us from God. And so he says there in verses 9 and 10, Lord, all my desire is before you, and my sighing is not hidden from you. My heart pants, my strength fails me. As for the light of my eyes, it also has gone from me. My desire should be to go to God and to be with Him, to let my troubles be before Him so that He's aware of what's going on with me. And the idea there is petitioning Him to be mindful of what's going on and to help me in that desire to be with the Lord. Isn't that what James said in James chapter 4 and verse 8? Draw near to God and He will draw near to you. That desire to be with the Lord. And recognizing that if we give place to sin, it will alienate us from God, will help to protect us from sin in our lives. And then he says in verse 13 and 14 that the correction for savage sin is to be deaf to the enemy. He says, but I, like a deaf man, do not hear. After he talked about how savage sin gives opportunity for the enemy, then he goes on in verse 13 and he says, but I'm deaf to them. I'm not going to listen to them. It's like I can't hear them. But I, like a deaf man, do not hear. And I am like a mute who does not open his mouth. Thus I am like a man who does not hear, and in whose mouth is no response. So I'm deaf to the enemy. And then we see the correction for savage sin in putting our hope in the Lord, verses 15 and 16. For in you, O Lord, I hope. You will hear, O Lord my God. For I said, hear me, lest they rejoice over me. Lest when my foot slips, they exalt themselves against me. And look how David there, in recognizing that he was in trouble, that he was in a sorrowful state, that he cries out to God and puts his hope in the Lord to be with him, to help him when he slips, and to protect him from his enemies. And so the correction for savage sin is to put your hope in the Lord.